Listen to this. Of what use is reason against the power of love? Love is life. So if you want to live, die in love. Die in love if you want to stay alive.
What's that supposed to mean?
I thought you'd like it.
If you want to be useful, try finding a book that'll tell us how to get out of here.
This isn't that kind of game.
Game? She thinks this is a game.
Do you remember Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time? This game is one of the most popular games of the early 2000s, and there were a lot of bangers released in that same specific year, along with this one. Take that for a nostalgia hit. The game was released between October 2003 and January 2004 on a multitude of platforms and had different dates depending on the platform and region. The game would also be released later on the PlayStation 3 as part of the Classics HD titles, along with the other two from the trilogy. We also have a remake being developed, and unfortunately it was delayed indefinitely at the time of this video, most likely because of the backlash that occurred once the gameplay came out. We don't know if that's the reason exactly, but I'm curious to see how they improved the game. If they managed to fix the things that bothered me, which I will talk about here, while adding a new coat of paint, I'll be very happy. Sands of Time was published by Ubisoft and developed by Ubisoft, but in Montreal. As I said earlier, this game was one of the most popular games at the time of release, and it was definitely one of Ubisoft's best franchises. It's considered as one of the greatest games of all time, and I couldn't agree more. They already had quite a reputation with the games they released until then, and this one is definitely a game that put Ubisoft on the map. I don't know about you, but when I used to hear about Ubisoft, the first game that came to my mind was Prince of Persia, and later on I'd start to associate them with Far Cry and Assassin's Creed. The Sands of Time is actually a reboot of the Prince of Persia series created by Jordan Mechner. The first Prince of Persia game was apparently pretty good, but its sequels, not so much. I personally didn't get a chance to play any of them, unfortunately, so I can't give an exact opinion of my own. After Ubisoft bought the rights for the franchise in 2001, Mechner served as a creative consultant, designer, and scenario writer for The Sands of Time. One of his involvements was to keep this game's narrative simple and have the story presented through the gameplay, which was done very well in my opinion. And this is the reason why you'll see the cinematics from the game looking odd and unpolished in a way. Now, let's get to the game, shall we? So, right from the beginning, we have some very nice music playing in the main menu, which really works with the tone of the game. Stuart Chatwood is the composer of the whole soundtrack, and he will move on to work on the whole trilogy as well as the Prince of Persia game released in 2008. He has some amazing pieces in here, very memorable, from soothing ones such as Behold the Sands of Time, and fighting, blood-pumping ones such as Trouble at the Barracks, the Tower of Dawn,
You know, not everything is bad.
or Prelude Fight. The game itself is presented as a story that the prince himself tells to Farah. We take part in it by going through his own shoes, the exact way that he tells it.
And I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
A very nice aspect that I noticed is that when you try to save the game, or when the game over screen is displayed, the prince will talk to you and react to what you do.
Shall I continue my story from here the next time we're interrupted? Done. I'll start the story from here next time. Do you wish me to leave before finishing my story?
I found this very immersive. It was like I was actually listening to a sort of audiobook, a video game book, if you will. As always, keep in mind that this game has been out for 20 years. I think exactly 20 years, if I think about it for a second. So I will most likely spoil the story. Here is a description that I found about the game. The game follows an unnamed prince whose father sacks an ancient city at the instigation of a traitorous vizier. During the attack, the prince obtains an artifact called the Dagger of Time, while his father's army captures an hourglass containing the mysterious Sands of Time. Visiting the palace of the Sultan of Azad to present the sands as a gift, the vizier tricks the prince into releasing the sands, transforming the people of Azad into savage monsters under his control. Together with Farah, a young princess who knows the power of the sands, the prince works to correct his mistake and foil the vizier's evil plans. And here are my own thoughts of the game. This dude, Prince, middle name of and last name Persia, coincidentally is also the Prince of Persia, is the adopted son of King Shahraman, Persia. These two went to visit the Sultan of Azad, and on the road there, the vizier of the local Maharaja played them like a couple of bitches to attack the Maharaja. During the assault, the prince does what every neglected child with daddy issues does to get some recognition from his parents. He found a way to get the attention and validation of his father by stealing a heavily guarded artifact known as the Dagger of Time, and then being pressured by some old dying dude that he immediately trusted to insert his dagger into the Hourglass of Time and then bring the end of the world along with his father's death. Nice job, Prince. He will then move on to take responsibility.
This is your doing.
I saw my father turn to sand.
To blame others for his own stupidity and be a total asshole to the only other person alive.
I know where I am. This gate leads to the baths. Do you think you could find your way there?
Of course, finding my way to the baths from here should be easy.
Good. I'll meet you there.
I'll meet you at the baths. She orders me around as if I were a servant. It's my own fault. With women, you need to show them you're in charge right from the start, or they'll walk all over you. I've been too indulgent. Probably because I felt sorry for her. Well, it stops now. From now on, she'll have to toe the line. That is, assuming I can find her.
Thankfully, this other person is a strong, independent woman who doesn't take too much shit from this excuse of royalty and sticks a couple of arrows into his ass to remind him who the real boss is.
Ow!
In the end, though, he still managed to fuck everything up. But it's okay because, compared to your mom, he has the ability to turn back time to stop himself from giving birth to the apocalypse. The prince is an arrogant, spoiled fucking brat, but this is the way he has been raised as a royalty. As a future king, he is pressured to be a firm and strong leader by his father, and so he seeks validation from him, gets some of those father points if you will, and thus thinks that by stealing a precious treasure, he might just receive that validation. We will also learn that he's a complete dick to women. He will have to work with Farah, the Maharaja's daughter, to find the vizier and the Hourglass of Time. During their time together, we will see the prince not taking kindly to her bossing him around. He is very skeptical about trusting Farah. He sees her trying to steal his dagger, and some trust issues are developed, especially since she was affiliated with the Maharaja's vizier. At the same time, the prince is the idiot who literally brought the end of the world, so Farah's reason for not trusting him is also fair enough. Their relationship is very complicated. They start off as partners, but as they spend more time together, they fall in love with each other. Definitely doesn't help the fact that they are the last human survivors around. He will slowly grow up as they go through all the challenges of reaching the hourglass. He will start loving Farah and see a future together, wanting to marry her. although he still has the same royal mentality of wanting to tame her? What the fuck, Prince?
I could marry her. After all, she is a Maharaja's daughter. A conquered one, but still. Her blood is royal. Besides, what better way to tame her insolence? It's not so bad for a woman to have a little spirit. It's a challenge!
As the game moves on, the prince will develop certain mental conditions due to his solitary state. At first, he talks in his head, and then as we progress, he will start talking out loud. He is aware of it and constantly tells himself to
Stop talking to yourself!
I can't not mention that he has that 90s e-boy haircut with the absolute perfect hairline and looks like he was part of the Backstreet Boys. The prince's appearance changes throughout the game. You start off with his full princey outfit. He will then take off his head wrap and use his left sleeve to cover up an injury. When his right sleeve is torn, he rips it off entirely, and after he falls into the palace jails, he takes off his entire torso clothing, leaving only his sword scabbard wrapped around. He will also proceed to clean himself up after a fight of rolling around in the dirt, and this was another cool detail. I'm usually impressed by these small things, and like I said, it adds up to the immersion. Now, another absolutely huge part regarding the prince is that at some point during the game, I was listening to him talk to himself, and it just clicked like that. He is voiced by Yuri Lowenthal. This dude has a huge portfolio of voice acting, Matt Miller in Saints Row, Ben 10 in multiple Ben 10 shows, and his most recent and popular one, Spider-Man in Marvel's Spider-Man released in 2018, and Miles Morales, of course. I always associated his voice with the Prince of Persia, and apparently I forgot he played in it until now. Another character he voiced that not so many people probably recognized or even listened to is Sasuke from Naruto English dub. Yes, I watch English dub anime. Fuck you. Funny how this guy managed to voice 3 huge agile characters, among others, that like to wall crawl. Farah will be there as well as an accompanying AI. She will help and follow you around and even get in the way sometimes. She might even hit you if you stand in front of her when shooting an arrow, but she will apologize afterwards. This also shows that she isn't very proficient with a bow and arrow, and that makes sense. She is also royalty and probably didn't get a military training in archery. She has her own health bar and the enemies will try to attack her. You can go ahead and kill the enemy near her, but you need to be careful not to hit her as well, as she can take damage from your attacks. If you hit her multiple times, she will even attack back,
What are you
which
trying
is a
to
great
do?
detail.
Kill me? Don't do that!
Ow!
Sorry.
Several puzzles will require teamwork, and I had absolutely no issues with this. She does what needs to be done most of the time. She will also constantly chat with the prince as well as react to a lot of the actions that he takes. Falling, getting hit, going into the Sandbeam, etc, etc.
Are you alright?
I'm fine, thanks.
The game is third person, you can move the camera freely and also allows for 2 additional views. Landscape and first person, which should help you find your way out of an area or give you a different perspective into solving a puzzle. The camera can be quite annoying at times as it's not easily controllable by using the controller joysticks. When moving around during fights, the camera might start twitching because it overlaps with certain objects and can even get you killed. The worst times this has happened to me was when fighting in very narrow spaces with objects such as pillars or walls getting in the way. Usually when fighting in a larger room, it can be neglected. The game itself is focused and built on the idea of platforming and doing parkour. Like a lot of the games released in the 2000s, this was probably inspired from The Matrix, with the slow-mo moves and all the wall running. If you want to know which other game was inspired from The Matrix and revolutionized bullet time in video games, make sure to check out my Do You Remember Max Payne video. these acrobatic feats that our protagonist possesses were actually inspired from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater most of all. The prince can jump, run up or across the walls, shimmy up and down beams, and so on. These agile skills of our prince allow him to explore the now slowly crumbling palace of Azad. You will do a lot of wall running. However, if the prince has by any chance stepped in water, he will slip when climbing up a wall. This is done for several sections of the game where you need to find your way around those puddles of water, and running up walls is prohibited. It will take you an attempt or two to succeed until his feet are dry again. Wall running is only part of the shit ton of platforming that you will exercise, and it can feel repetitive when you need to do the same moves over again to progress through the game and solve puzzles. A combination of these three aspects, fighting, traversing, and solving puzzles, are the main things that you will have to go through throughout the whole game. One early puzzle that you will have to solve is the palace defense system. Once solved, a bunch of traps are activated throughout the palace that did jack shit anyway, because the sand creatures will just come back if they are defeated by normal attacks. Those traps only made the prince's job harder and more dangerous. Using his sword as a main weapon, he can eliminate his enemies, and as you progress through the game, new swords can be found that will make defeating older types of enemies easier. However, tougher enemies will start spawning more often to keep up the challenge. The Dagger of Time will be with him throughout most of the game, and it's used to absorb the downed enemies, but it can be a little finicky at times. Both freezing and absorption of enemies are done by the same button key, so you might end up doing one of them while wanting to do the other. This might lead to a manner of accidents because of the lack of a lock-on system. Using the power of the dagger, the prince can unleash some devastating attacks, one of which is the Mega Freeze, which will teleport you from one enemy to the other, destroying them in 2 hits. I pretty much abuse this power because I noticed that between fights, there's usually a sand cloud on the ground somewhere that would instantly restore all the resources needed for this power. The sword and the dagger, together with the prince's agility, allow for quite a good number of combos to be performed. The one move that I try to use probably the whole game is the jump and double hit. There are multiple jump attacks that you can do, and you will of course learn new moves as you progress. The prince can also parry by holding down the block button and pressing the main or dagger attack button right before the moment he'll get hit. He will then proceed to attack or absorb the enemy depending on what button you pressed. I found parrying very difficult. It doesn't help that the prince is squishy as fuck and he'll get killed very easily if the parries are unsuccessful. It's supposed to be a counterattack to the one done by the enemy. However, the enemy can deflect your parry and attack you again, parrying your parry, and then it keeps going on and on. So it's a very high risk move, and to me it wasn't very rewarding. After fucking up all those parries, you can thankfully drink water from different water sources around the game to replenish your health. Now, I don't know why the fuck would the prince drink water from certain places, such as public ponds or areas where absolutely everyone steps in, but whatever. Might have been nice that if you drank water from a dirtier water source, you get some debuff where the maximum health bar would decrease until you found a fountain or more of a cleaner source of water to regain your loss. But anyway. The health bar can be increased by fighting certain spots in the game, which will lead you to a place that seems ethereal. Coincidentally, at the center of it, there is a fountain that after drinking, the maximum health is increased. Aside from the health bar, the prince has an hourglass-like meter, or a sand meter, as well as an additional sand meter that can be seen on the edge of the hourglass. The hourglass allows the prince to rewind time for around 10 seconds by using one charge that can later be replenished by killing enemies. There's a small thing to keep in mind here, which is that after absorbing an enemy, the timer resets. So if you, let's say, die right after absorbing an enemy, you won't be able to rewind. The sand storage can be increased by finding sand clouds that I talked about earlier, scattered around the world. Absorbing several of them will allow the prince to store more sand into the dagger. The second sand storage, or second storage, please don't unsub, will allow the prince to freeze enemies or do the so-called time combos, such as the Mega Freeze mentioned earlier. Attacking a frozen enemy will leave the prince vulnerable, and the nearby enemies will immediately attack him, so be careful with that. What types of enemies will the prince encounter on his journey? At the first levels of the game, you can see some of the people in their human form. This is to give a glimpse of how they will be changed and how their armor and base structure is kept once they become sand creatures. Here the prince will have to fight the soldiers of the Maharaja, which are there mostly for tutorial reasons. As soon as the Hourglass of Time is opened, all of the Azad soldiers and people, as well as the prince's own army, are turned into sand creatures. I did notice that the game has like two subsets of enemy types. The main one, which are the bigger ones that necessitate absorption by the dagger, and the other smaller ones that are killed by normal hits. The latter is composed of the birds, scarabs, and bats. These types you might encounter in between certain sections of the game, but the main subset of enemies are the ones that will be bound to a certain area, and all of them will need to be destroyed in order to progress. One type of enemy that your teenage self probably enjoyed the most is the harem choke me mommy creatures that look like Rule 34 concept artists made them. Leading on to the first boss fight, where you fight your own father, who is now turned into the Sand King. No, not that Sand King, this Sand King. You will find your first real challenge here. He defends most normal attacks that you've been doing up to this point, and requires you to think outside the box and be more patient. He is guarded by some blue sand soldiers, among others, and in comparison to the red ones, these are invulnerable to the jumps that I've been abusing so far. We will also meet sand blacksmiths, sand warriors, and a whole lot more sand.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
The generals are the most challenging, intimidating, and big creatures I've encountered later in the game, and even they are easily defeated by the right move. I noticed that every single enemy type usually has a combo that works for them, so if you experiment enough, you can see what type of attack works with every enemy, and then just keep repeating that, making the game easier than it seems. Once an encounter with the enemies is finished, the music stops and an animation of the prince sheathing his sword will play. This animation is presented as a notification that fighting is done and there are no more enemies nearby. It can also be fast forwarded by pressing the attack button, and then he can safely run into the Sandbeam. Speaking of the Sandbeam, I don't know if that's what it's officially called, but it looks like a light beam and is made from sand, so that's that. The sandbeams are generated by killing the enemies in an area. The sandbeam will grow larger as enemies are defeated, so it can also be used as a progress meter of how many monsters are left in that specific area. Once all of them are gotten rid of, the prince can enter the sandbeam, which will trigger a vision. This vision will show clips of the prince's future, routes, enemies, new moves, or glimpses of the story that we'll get to see. If the vision shows that the prince dies, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen, so they work more like guidelines. This is such an awesome way of implementing visions, the concept of time, and seeing in the future of the game. These sandbeams are also used as a save point, so you can save the game after seeing the vision, and they're actually pretty frequent, so you don't really need to worry about not having the game saved. Now, let me tell you some smaller cool and not so cool stuff that I found while playing the game. It has quite some nice physics. The cloth around the world responds to the prince's movements. Running on walls will also move the banners hanging around, as well as curtains and other similar materials. Depending on his position to the enemy and direction in which he jumps over them, a different grab and jump animation will commence. The prince is very well animated. When doing certain combos, different cinematic angles will be displayed to show you how the prince does his moves. The environment, of course, changes as you go, and there's a lot of variety in it. From night to day, from castle walls to gardens, caves, prison, sewers, and so on. There's also a movie for this game starring Jake Gyllenhaal, which I personally thought was fine. it was definitely one of the better video game adaptations. Could have been much better, obviously, but it wasn't terrible in my opinion. Now, to the more annoying stuff. I once got a random game over screen and Farah was dancing all of a sudden. I don't know what I did or what happened at that point, but it did. The water texture for some reason was at a very low resolution. It literally looked pixelated. Might be due to my screen resolution being 1440p, and there's the possibility of the water having an even lower resolution than the maximum one for which the game was developed. The widescreen patch that I applied transformed the black bars on the sides that you'd normally see to the actual game itself. However, some UI elements are still displayed at a 4:3 ratio. For instance, Farah's health bar will be displayed around the middle of the screen where the black bars would start appearing. At some point during the game, the prince falls down to progress through the palace prison. I don't understand why he wouldn't immediately use the dagger to turn back time and prevent that from happening. I doubt that he didn't have time to take out his dagger and activate it, since it takes us a long time to get back up, so it was most likely quite a lengthy fall. I'm just saying. So, in conclusion, I think the game holds up better than others. The main issues I found were the combat being a little bit one-dimensional. You have to use certain abilities and combos to overpower your enemies because the others just don't work, or I didn't manage to make them work. The camera was another annoying aspect. It can literally get in the way during combat, and the game was rather short. I don't know why I remembered it being longer. I managed to finish it in around 5 hours. Other than that, I found it extremely entertaining. I liked the story, and usually the subject of time manipulation in a lot of games, movies, or books is a very sensitive subject. This was a creative way to do time manipulation and visions, and the sequels will come to explain more that the butterfly effect is real, and manipulating time has a lot of consequences. I enjoyed the last sections of the game quite a bit, mostly because they are much more intense since you lose your dagger and have no time abilities anymore. So dying will leave you, well, dead. However, the game helps you with some checkpoints, so if you fall or die, you don't have to start again at the last save point. The Vizier boss fight was extremely simplistic. I can't even call it a boss fight. I feel like it was added there more for closure, for the satisfaction of killing an already dying Vizier that we've been searching for the whole game. The mechanics were absent. You had to kill an illusion of the Vizier 3 times with different moves, and that's it. The Sand King fight was more fun and challenging. I wish this was that, and a little bit more. The ending itself was fine. The prince managed to go back in time and stop himself from using the dagger. He actually gave it back to Farah, but she didn't know who he was because, well, it's before they met in the present or future? Yeah, typical time manipulation writing. It gets confusing to explain. The point is that he made everything right, Farah is safe, and there are no sand creatures anymore. However, the prince played with time, and the strands are now entangled. So who knows what time will bring in the future? Or present? Or past? Are you guys excited for the remake? Because I personally am, but I'm also a little bit skeptical. If they manage to succeed with it, we will be able to also go back in time and experience one of the greatest games of the 2000s with a modern touch, the way that we used to see it back then. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Make sure to do all of that YouTube stuff if you wish. If you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, let me know in the comments. I'll make sure to read all of them. With that being said, take care, everyone.